Hello, my name is Johanna Svanikier, founder and president of the Heritage and Cultural Society of Africa. Welcome all to the first series of HACSA webinars, which will discuss and address some of the issues raised by the global crises that have hit the year 2020 in quick succession. It began with a world war against the coronavirus, continued with the crash of financial markets and the oil price, and we are now experiencing the largest global mass movement against racism that the world has ever seen. After the murder of yet another black man, George Floyd, by police over a $20 bill in the United States of America. The reaction to these events around the world has been to challenge the existing world order by first questioning the harm that it does to our environment, and secondly, the systemic racism that pervades and permeates the institutions and corridors of power around the world, especially in the so-called free world. Today, the topic for discussion is systemic racism in the diaspora. Is this a turning point? We have a very distinguished and experienced panel made up of 2 women and 2 men, whom I shall now introduce. Our first panelist is Mr. Barry Ford, who began his undergraduate studies at Harvard University and continued to earn a JD from Harvard Law School, where he was in the same class as President Obama. He joined the Council for a Strong America in 2015, where he served as its Chief Operating Officer and Executive Vice President, and was named President and CEO in January 2019. He has more than 30 years of professional experience as a government official, lawyer, nonprofit executive, and political candidate. Prior to joining the staff of the Council for a Strong America, Mr. Ford's experience included being a community lobbyist in New York City, a 2-time candidate for the US House of Representatives, and an associate with the international law firm Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. He has also been a policy advocate for quality out-of-school programs for over 15 years. Our next panelist is Ms. Belle Ribeiro-Addy, who was born and raised in Stratham, London. She's the joint first woman of direct African descent in the British Parliament and proudly spoke of her Ghanaian heritage during her maiden speech in Parliament. She was elected as the Labour MP for Stratham in 2019 with a majority of 17,690. She graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Science from the University of Bradford and later gained a Master of Arts in Medical Laws and Ethics at Queen Mary University, London in 2007, and a graduate diploma in law in 2015. She was the National Black Students Officer for the National Union of Students from 2008 to 2010, National Coordinator of the Student Assembly Against Racism, and the National Convener of the NUS Anti-Racism, Anti-Fascism Campaign. Before becoming a Member of Parliament, she was Chief of Staff to former Labour frontbencher Diane Abbott MP. Ms. Ribeiro-Addy is a member of the Labour Party's Socialist Campaign Group and has challenged the role of the media in devaluing Black female MPs, particularly regarding errors in the media, which carelessly mixed up the identities of Black women parliamentarians. In January 2020, Ms. Ribeiro-Addy was appointed Shadow Minister for Immigration a few weeks after her election as an MP. She was relieved of her position following the election of the current Labour Party leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who recently criticized British Black Lives Matter protesters for toppling the statue of a prolific and notorious slave trader, Edward Colston, which stood in the city centre of Bristol. Along with other members of the House, Bell has demanded that the British government should have a full parliamentary debate on Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. Our third panelist is Mr. Ebenezer Asmati, a Ghanaian graduate student in international relations at the University of Oxford. He graduated with a BA in political science from the University of Ghana and as a Felix Scholar with a Masters of Science in International Politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. In his first year at Oxford, he served as a Student Equalities Officer for Mansfield College. After completing his MPhil, he hopes to pursue his doctoral research in realpolitik and great power management of the international order at the UN Security Council. In October 2019, Mr. Asmati, who is blind, reserved a seat at the Oxford Union prior to an event. When he returned, he was refused entry and after sitting on his reserved seat was violently removed from the hall. The incident was recorded by another member and subsequently uploaded onto the internet. This led to protests from the University of Oxford Africa Society on Mr. Asmati's behalf, which gained wide international news media coverage. The president of the Oxford Union subsequently apologized for the incident and resigned his position. Our final panelist today is Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, who gained her PhD from NYU and is an associate professor of English education at Teachers College, Columbia University. She is a former research associate with the NYU Metropolitan Center for Urban Education and has worked for Business Week, the New York Times, and New York University in marketing and promotion. Her research interests include racial literacy development in urban teacher education with a specific focus on the education of Black and Latino males, literacy practices of Black girls, and Black female college reentry students. Dr. Sealey-Ruiz's work has appeared in several top-tier academic journals. She's also the co-editor of 3 books, including Teacher Education and Black Communities, Implications for Access, Equity, and Achievement. At Teachers College, she is founder and faculty sponsor of the Racial Literacy Roundtable series, where national scholars, postgraduate students, and young people facilitate informal conversations around race and other issues, including diversity and teacher education for the Columbia University community. She's also the co-founder of the Teachers College Civic Participation Project, which concerns itself with the educational well-being of young people caught up in the juvenile system and foster care systems in New York. Dr. Ruiz and 2 of her students appeared in Spike Lee's Two Fists Up, We Gon' Be Alright, a 2016 documentary about the Black Lives Matter movement. Dr. Sealey-Ruiz's first full-length volume of poetry, Love from the Vortex and Other Poems, topped Amazon's list for African American poetry for 3 consecutive weeks. I would like to welcome you all again to the HACSA Live webinar series and to thank our panelists for agreeing to share their knowledge and experience with us today. Today, our topic is systemic racism in the diaspora. Is this a turning point? Mr. Barry Ford, you are an African-American male, a law graduate from Harvard University, an experienced political activist, an executive, and a leader in your society. Could you please put into context for us the events that have led to the Black Lives Matter movement and protests in the US, and give us your opinion on what can be done for this to be a real turning point in the struggle for the equal treatment of Black people in America by the police and the wider society?
Thank you so much for that, Ambassador Svanikier. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. I know that we are the inaugural panel for the HACSA series that you launched, and I appreciate being your first speaker. Let me start with this. The Black Lives Matter movement as a movement was launched after the violence of Ferguson. The police killing of Michael Brown and the deep systemic issues that existed in that city that were exposed by that killing. For many years afterward, that's 5 years ago. For many years after that, the movement continually emphasized the importance of taking Black lives seriously. But it didn't get the national or worldwide attention until 2 weeks ago when all of our consciences were shocked. What happened to George Floyd, and the fact, this is an important point, I'm going to detail why it is, and the fact it was caught on videotape, and that it lasted almost 9 minutes, is what I think has been the fundamental game changer in the way people think about this issue. It is a shame it took that. It is awful that it took such an egregious abuse and violence on the part of a sworn police officer for it to shock the conscience of our country and frankly of so many around the world about the enduring inequity and violence perpetrated on Black people in my society, but frankly, I think it's true in many societies around the country, around the world. So, but what I worry about with regard to that fact, the fact that it took a video, it took such an egregious behavior to bring the phrase Black Lives Matter to the lips of everyone, including a leading Republican member of the Senate, Mitt Romney, and his joining the protests in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago. I worry that it will be viewed as simply an isolated incident and the incident of a bad apple behaving egregiously, because it's not. And let me tell you why I believe it's not. What that police officer in Minneapolis did was at one end of a continuum that has as its source an ongoing structural legacy of white supremacy in our country that has been with us since the founding. The way in which that social structure has expressed itself in the lives of our nation and the lives of Black people has adapted and morphed and changed rapidly over the course of 400 years of history. But the way it manifests itself now is everything from the killing of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery to the behavior of Amy Cooper in Central Park. Now, that wasn't a killing, right? No one was hurt. Amy Cooper is a white woman who would have testified the day before she met Christian Cooper that she didn't have a racist bone in her body. She would have said that she was committed to equal rights and justice, that she was a good Democrat, a good liberal, and that she cared about the welfare of all people in our society. Yet, when she encountered a Black man she did not know, who all he did was call her out on the rules of the park. Remember, that's all he did. He said, just put your dog on a leash. No, can't have your dog off the leash. No, it scares the birds. And he happened to be a bird watcher. Her response to that was to call the cops on him and lie about what he was doing. With the most deeply baked racial trope that exists in our society. In some ways, the reason I mentioned that example, Ambassador, is that in some ways, her behavior is more egregious and more insidious than the behavior of that cop. And this is something I want you to think about. So I mentioned it earlier. Imagine if we didn't have a video of it. Imagine if we didn't have a video of the killing of George Floyd. Imagine if we didn't have a video of Ahmaud Arbery. Those vigilantes in Georgia would still be home untroubled, but for that video. So I give you this recitation partly because I want us to understand how deeply embedded this is, right? So it's not just the outlier cop that does something so egregious. It's no one is defending him. This is true. No one, no police agency, no senior executive in law enforcement. I lead an organization, I have the privilege of leading an organization that organizes the voices of really good, conscious law enforcement leaders all across the country. We have over 5,000 police chiefs, sheriffs, and district attorneys and prosecutors as our members And their perspective is, to fight crime effectively in communities, you need to invest in children. That's the name of our organization. Fight crime, invest in kids. So they're on board with the idea we need to do much more in our communities to make our communities safe. But so none of them think what happened with that cop did in Minneapolis had anything to do with policing. But I don't think any of them prior to that would have seen the Amy Coopers as an issue, right? And so that dichotomy, that disconnection, that misunderstanding is frankly where I think we ultimately need to go as a community, particularly as a society in the United States. I can't speak for the diaspora. I look forward to hearing the perspectives of others on that. But in the United States, we need to first acknowledge the existence of systemic racism that manifests itself in essentially our expectations about what the status quo is, about what is normal in our society. And then I'll close with a couple of key points there. The fact that the disparate lives that most African Americans live as compared to their white counterparts, the fact that for the most part, Americans' first instinct is to attribute that disparity in opportunity and health and education and wealth to the inherent nature of African Americans is actually a racist idea. It's a fundamentally misunderstood. It's a racist idea. But it's deeply baked in who we are. It's the story we as a country have been telling ourselves, certainly, probably for as long as we've been a nation, but we've been telling ourselves this story in earnest since the end of the Civil War. As Henry Louis Gates has highlighted, we profoundly misunderstand Reconstruction, because during the Reconstruction era, Black leadership was actually in many ways positive leadership. And to discredit it, to reestablish white control of the South, there had to be a story told about the evil, inherent, and so incorrigible nature of African Americans. That's when being an African American translated being a criminal. And so until we address that, and then let me get to two practical pieces and then I'll close. We need to operate at two different levels at this time, and reformers and activists are calling for it all across the country. We need to address the issues around police practice and police procedures. So limiting chokeholds, better processes, more community involvement, more oversight. That has to happen. That's in legislation at the federal level, and many cities are moving forward with that. But I would argue that's only the first step. The second step is we need to have a real serious conversation about the allocation of resources, the real meaning of opportunity. And I think it starts with real significant and fundamental investments in children and families across our country. And so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ford. And I'll come back to you later to ask you what individuals can do to make this change happen faster. But now I'd like to move on to Ms. Bell Ribeiro-Addy. Ms. Bell Ribeiro-Addy, the Black Lives Matter movement has strongly resonated in Britain, and there are mounting protests and calls for the government to acknowledge and face up to Britain's own legacy and involvement in the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. Will this happen?
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I think it's really, really important that we're having all of these discussions. And I think the main reason why it's resonated so much for us in the UK, because our situation is very similar. Obviously, we can't say that everything is exactly identical. We have different experiences in terms of how different minorities came into our respective countries, but the issue is being a minority, and the issue is how that has led to us being treated. And the issue very much stems from slavery and colonialism. And directly speaking on what happened with George Floyd, that's something that happens in the UK all the time. I mean, it's very, very difficult for a number of families to gain that much publicity when these situations happen. And it's only a few of them that ever make it through. But we've had 1,741, if I'm counting correctly, deaths in police custody following contact with the police. And not a single one of those police officers in the UK has faced any form of prosecution. And we know that Black people in this country are more likely to have received harsher sentences when they do have contact with the police. They are overrepresented in the prison population. And we also know that it doesn't stop there in terms of racial inequality, not just our contact with the police. It's that we're over-policed as citizens and under-policed as victims. So when an incident happens with an individual, a Black individual, we are more likely to see an investigation into exactly what happened with them stop earlier. We see inequalities in housing, education, healthcare. We're seeing this quite terribly in response to COVID-19, with more people of Black and Asian descent dying quite disproportionately in relation to our numbers in the UK. So we see all of this. And so the protests in this country we're seeing are against the backdrop of all of that. People are angry. They've seen what's happened in the US. They know that it happens here. And it's against the backdrop of the type of leaders we have. In the US, you have Donald Trump, and in the UK, we have his cousin, I like to call him, Boris Johnson. They are very much of the same ilk. They have said some of pretty much the same very disgraceful things, and they seem to have the same types of agenda. So we've had economic crashes across the world, and in the UK we've had 10 years of austerity, and in those years of austerity, Black communities have suffered the worst in that sense. And after COVID-19, we are headed for another economic recession, and we know what usually happens when that comes about. So we're seeing all of these protests against that backdrop, and I think we're seeing all of these protests against the backdrop where communities that are suffering in that way are just tired. They're just tired. They have had enough. They're not going to take it anymore. And I'm really pleased to see the protests that have been mounted. I'm pleased to see that actually people are talking about education, not just the moment and not just the issues of the moment, but education. And that shows that people want to bring about real change, real systemic change, because nobody is actually born racist. It's not possible. When they come into this world, a baby is born, they know nothing. Every single racist behavior, microaggressions, the way in which they operate when they're in institutions, all of those things are learned. And that's why there's such a huge focus at the moment, I believe, on amending our education system so these things are taught. Unfortunately, in the UK, despite, and I believe this to some extent in the US, although I believe there's been further ways forward, in the UK, despite our very, very apparent relationship with slavery and colonialism, these things are not discussed. So the UK is a relatively small island in comparison to the other world's largest economies that it's on par with. And you have to ask yourself, how did you reach this level of influence in an entire world due to your size? And that has a lot to do with slavery and colonialism. They are the very bedrock of our nation in terms of how they have come to be. They're the very bedrock of our economic situation, yet they are not discussed. We even managed to omit the Commonwealth forces, the Black, African, Caribbean, and Asian officers that fought in the Second World War. I was shocked to find that on D-Day, all of the Black forces were moved out and the white forces were moved back in to lead the parade. And that gave a very, very different view of what happened. They call it a world war because we were all involved. But whenever, veterans are glorified, they are forever glorifying just the European forces, not the many Black forces that found themselves on the front line and died for the freedom of our respective countries. So in terms of change, I'm really, really pleased to see how people are behaving, even white people asking themselves questions. How can I be a better anti-racist? I note that the book White Fragility sold out on Amazon last week. So people are really asking themselves some questions. They're also coming out on protest. A lot of organizations want to make sure that they are associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, and lots of different are taking lots of different measures. And, you know, some of these are quite obviously tokenistic, but this moment in history shows that we have people's attention. So it's very, very important that we strike while the iron is hot, and we make clear that we want lasting change. And one of these absolutely has to be education. As to whether or not we're going to get it, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day. The struggle very, very much continues. But I feel that if there was a moment in time when things were going to shift, it's now. And I know from my perspective, I'm very, very much pushing for changes in our education system here. I believe that, you know, with the tearing down of the statue, people have complained about loads of different things and whether or not it was criminal damage or not. And I would say to that whether or not it was right or wrong is less important than the fact that individuals in this country are now questioning their history. Individuals now know about that man, and nobody knew who he was before. Well, not nobody. The people in Bristol very much knew who he was, but others did not know who he was. And people are asking questions about different statues. So we are, you know, having a reawakening, reassessing our history, not replacing our history or erasing our history, as some people have attempted to say, but we are correcting it. We are inserting the things that were quite clearly removed. And when we reinsert those things, I think we will help to readdress some of the issues that we are clearly facing, and the understanding that people have of where racial inequality comes from. So I know it's going to be a long road, but I am extremely hopeful for change.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bell Ribeiro-Addy. I'd like to continue the conversation later on about education and what kind of conversations people are having about education. But now I'll move on to Mr. Ebenezer Asmati, who happens to be in education. Mr. Asmati, you have experienced firsthand the abuse and manhandling experienced by Black males, and the way simple disputes are escalated when Black males are involved. In spite of being blind, you were dragged out of the Oxford Union Hall after a dispute over a seat you reserved for an upcoming debate. Can you describe that experience in your own words, your experience with the British media, and what can be done to ensure this never happens again?
Thank you very much, madam, for the opportunity afforded me. I'm very grateful to be part of this experienced panel. Indeed, you started my introduction quite well, saying you're going to Azmati, who is in education. You would have thought that this is an institution that is into education, right? And as the previous speaker ended, education is important. So by this time, we would have realized how much people who have gone through the four walls of this institution would have changed their minds, and etc. But indeed, the incident you described happened in an educational institution. How ironic. I have to make sure, am I sure that there's no security guard outside my door ready to pull me out? Anyway, when you sit in a hall full of about 700 mortals like you, and you have two big men coming over to pull you out, and nobody stands up to even say, oh, what is wrong? To even ask the two big men what is wrong. That in itself is much traumatizing than you being pulled out physically. Because you would ask yourself, indeed, if I'm human, like the other 699 people sat in this room, how come none of them is standing up to come and say, oh, what is wrong? To come and ask why is he being pulled out? To at least come, and even not to your defense, at least appear to come in and verify what was wrong. That is the most traumatizing aspect of the whole thing. It is indeed an experience I would never wish on anyone. Because anybody who has seen me before, anybody who knows me, knows that I'm a tiny piece of bread. And just imagine two huge men trying to get rid of this tiny piece of bread on the bench. It's horrific. It's an experience I wish I never went through, because unfortunately, it has had to define my 2-year stay in Oxford, which is quite unfortunate. When you heard of Oxford as a young boy in school, you obviously wish to go there, but never expected to have your stay there defined by an incident where you were pulled out of a debate chamber where democracy is supposed to be the order of the day. But you see, what happened at the Oxford Union is as interesting and very difficult to talk about as how the media portrayed it. So if any of you has your phone in front of you or your computer in front of you, just Google Ebenezer Asmati. And the first 10 headlines you would see: a blind Black student dragged out of the Oxford Union, a Black blind student dragged out of the Oxford Union, a Black Ghanaian student dragged out of the Oxford Union, a blind Black student dragged out of the Oxford Union, etc., etc. As if, one, I didn't have a name, and two, as if without being Black or blind, I would have no other identity. Three, as if without being Black or blind, I wasn't a member of the Oxford Union. I was just wondering if it was a white student that had been pulled out of the Oxford Union. I was wondering if all the media houses would have gone, a white blind student pulled out of the Oxford Union. I'm just wondering. I wouldn't be able to make any conclusion as of now. I'm just wondering, honestly. But it doesn't seem, and it doesn't appear to me as if that would have been the headline. It would have been something else, I suppose. And for me, the way the media captioned this whole incident and the way they went about it, the way they wrote about the whole thing, in itself reinforces racism in another way. Why do I say so? Because someone reading who first sees a Black student pulled out of the Oxford Union, imagine this person who already has his prejudices. What happens? Oh, these people, this is how they are. Well, they're just doing their job. So clearly, if a white person would not be portrayed in the news like this, I have up until today not been able to find any reason why Ebenezer Asmati, who has a name and an identity as a student of the University of Oxford and a member of the Oxford Union, has to be described on front pages as a blind Black student put out of the Oxford Union. If this doesn't have any undertones, then I don't know.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asmati, for describing your horrific experience at the Oxford Union.
If I could have a minute to, your third question was, how could it be stopped? For me, everybody has talked about education. Yes, I believe education is important. But for me, it's not just about education in the classroom. It goes beyond that. Education must occur on front pages of newspapers, on television screens, on online platforms, and even at debate chambers. Because fortunately or unfortunately, some people get education from different platforms. Some people get theirs in the classroom, others get theirs in newspapers, others get theirs on TV screens, through telenovelas and films, and some people even get theirs on the streets. So it shouldn't be about just changing curricula and inserting A, B, C, and D in textbooks, etc. Yes, children are important to be educated, but the adult on the street, the man in his garden, little garden somewhere, all need education. And how do we do it?
Thank you.
It cannot be left to the classroom.
I think,
Thank you.
yes, thank you so much. I think the debate on education is going to continue because our next guest and panelist is Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, and she has experience in educating teachers in urban America about race and literacy. Dr. Sealey-Ruiz, what does this mean? And do teachers in rural areas not also warrant education in race literacy? How does the existing education system in the US contribute to systemic racism? And what can be done to it to bring about real change to end systemic racism?
Thank you. Madam Sister Ambassador, thank you so much for this panel. I want to thank my fellow panelists. And I want to start answering that question by quoting a sister friend of mine, Dr. Kamika Royal. I was on a talk that she was sharing with Black doctoral students the other day about her own research process. And she said that racism is systemic, endemic, and embedded in America. So we're going to start with that, knowing that it is America. From 401 years ago, it is the stamp, as Ibram Kendi has talked to us about in Stamped from the Beginning, it is the stamp of America. In terms of education, I want to think about this broadly in the sense that I agree with Brother Ebenezer, and I also want to say that I am so sorry that you experienced that. I agree that it has to go beyond the classroom. However, every citizen, regardless of where they are at some point in a so-called progressive society, has sat in a classroom. That police officer who brutally murdered George Floyd was a student at one point. The police in my society, our society, at some point, like doctors, like lawyers, ambassadors, have been students. And so education has a very particular role to play. And we know that education, which is part of this systemic structure of racism, is not doing its job in the way that it should. And we can see that in various ways. We see it through, first of all, our public schools are a reflection of society. We see it in the curriculum. We see in what is deemed as worthy of teaching, whose experiences are deemed as worthy of teaching and whose are not. And so even in the absence of those, they're sending a message about what is important and what is not important. We also keep out the incredible history of Blacks across the diaspora and Blacks within America, within education systems. Number one, because teachers have not been taught it in their own education system, outside of the perhaps one diversity course they take in college, right? So most teachers in the US, about 85% are white and female. So number one, they're not getting the education. And number two, many of them may be afraid to engage with that education and to offer it to students. Because what they're probably most afraid of is what Gloria Ladson-Billings talks about, is building this socio-political consciousness of students. And so if you're presenting a history to students, number one, that shows the glory, right, of folks that part of their ancestral lineage, but also shows the rebellion, teachers are afraid that that will put ideas into children's mind, right? So the curriculum is corrupt for the most part. The education system has a wonderful opportunity and has not done its job, certainly since Brown versus Board of Education, which Lonnie Grenier and so many others argue that although it's the best thing we have, it indeed has been probably one of the biggest failures that we have in terms of legislation for education, because in effect, it created a tracking system for Black children, and it really just helped the white elite. And so even the case that we all turn to, Brown versus Board of Education, is still a failure for Black children in this country. And we know that it is systemic and it is deep. And to answer your question, Madam Ambassador, children in rural areas, children in suburban areas, children in urban areas, and teachers need to know about this history, and the teachers need to build racial literacy. And racial literacy, as I have conceptualized it, is an opportunity for us to engage with where these issues live within us. There's 6 components of it. Critical love is the basis. If you do not have a deep and profound respect and ethical commitment to the communities that you're serving, I'm arguing that you're not loving them. And if you're not loving them, you should not be teaching them. There is critical humility that must be practiced. Teachers must be aware and embrace the fact that they are likely racially illiterate. I mean, look at the school system and the structure of the country. There is a need for critical reflection, to reflect on what it is that you've been taught, what you feel you do know, and being able to make change, to be reflexive. Once you get new knowledge, right, you change. So for white women who saw the Amy Cooper video, right, once you see that so blatant, you have to be reflective to catch yourself if you ever want to engage in, let's say, white tears, if you want to engage in feeling that, oh my goodness, I'm threatened because a Black man is walking down the street. It's an opportunity to reflect on how you've been conditioned and to make changes. Another aspect of the racial literacy development model is historical literacy. We have to engage in the history of our country, the countries that we're in, and understand how neighborhoods, schools have been socially constructed, right? We have to understand the wider history and also the history of that particular town, that province, that neighborhood. We have to know what we're talking about. And as Dr. Jamila Liskott would say, you have to know what you're fighting for as much as what you're fighting against. And the penultimate piece of the racial literacy development model is this idea of the archaeology of the self. And for me, that is the crucial piece. How will all of this change? Individuals make policies. Individuals bring their beliefs to the table to make policies and practice. And unless that individual is willing to do a deep excavation, to rid the biases, the stereotypes, the hate, if you will, that's embedded in their heart. If the heart is dark, the work will be dark. Unless that excavation process takes place, then the last step of racial literacy development, interruption will never happen. I was talking to a group of educators the other day. I'm so grateful to be working with this multiracial group. And I came across the idea, it hit me, that as much as we are equity warriors, there are warriors of the status quo that we are fighting against, that are in police academies, holding on to practices, that are in schools and education systems, teacher education, colleges, holding on to practices, that we have to continue in the fight that we're in, because as much as we're equity warriors, there are status quo warriors. And so everyone needs to develop their racial literacy, and particularly teachers, because we are in a moment now, and I'm seeing it in New York City. They're framing it as remote learning because we're in the COVID and we know all of the injustices that have been revealed from that. But now is the time to make this change. And I think in education, we're poised to do it.
Very much, Dr. Sealey-Ruiz, for your insightful comments. A question has come through for Mr. Barry Ford. You yourself were at an elite university and college. similar to Mr. Asmati, at a time when there were even fewer Black and African Americans in elite universities. What was your experience there, and do you think things have changed since then, or do they still have some ways to go?
I appreciate the question. It was a complicated experience, right? The Harvard I went to in the mid '80s had many fewer African Americans, but frankly, students of color from any ethnic or racial background. And there was less institutional interest in the successful integration, incorporation of cultural differences into what the student body lived, experienced, engaged in. One of the core experiences I had was I had roommates who took it upon themselves to try and tell me how to be Black, which is a whole separate conversation, but I'll leave it. Suffice to say that I didn't take it well. So you fast forward now, 35 years after I've graduated from Harvard, my son is a junior there. And he's actually living in the same dorm that I was in when I was there. And his experience is actually different in some profound and positive ways, and unfortunately similar in some sad and familiar ways. So the change is that Harvard has become a much more diverse academic community. It really has. That diversity, unfortunately, does not dramatically extend to class diversity. Just be clear about that. It's still an elite institution for elite individuals who can have the resources to get their kids the prep and the experiences that they need and the academic preparation that they need. So there's a perpetuation of disparities in that fact of itself, right? But they have made a significant effort to build deeper communities that are transracial and positive. That and this generation of young people is much more open-minded and inclusive and willing to engage in that stuff. Where it hasn't done, it has not invested in the effort to really support young people who may not have had all of the core developmental experiences, still really talented, really smart, but may not have come from school systems as strong. It has not made an intentional effort to make sure those kids have the same level of experience and opportunities that kids from more privileged backgrounds. That's still the missing gap.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ford. I'd like to move on to Ms. Ribeiro-Addy. There's a question which has come in through for you. How do we transform education at the foundational level and at an international scale to reflect the suggestions of Dr. Sealey-Ruiz that education begins with loving those you are teaching? And how can we democratize education? That's a long, difficult one, but you did mention there is a debate starting up in the UK about education. What are people saying?
Well, for us in the UK, it certainly depends quite heavily on how our educational structure is set up. Obviously, there's quite a lot of guidance that comes from the Department for Education. So if the government were willing to make certain changes there would be a knock-on effect at a local level. However, our individual schools and individual councils and boroughs also have some sort of agency in terms of what is taught there. So it's looking at it twofold, looking at a top-down approach, but also looking at a bottom-up approach. I know that, let's say back in the 80s, we had a very, very big Saturday school movement in the UK, particularly amongst Caribbean communities, where they would actively have because of they recognise the issues in the education system, and because they recognise that a lot of their children were being held back, they supplemented that education on Saturday schools, which were organised by the communities. And those schools didn't just teach extra lessons on your core issues of English, maths and science. They also gave them an education of Black history. And that's something that we haven't seen in this country for a while. So I think it's definitely a multifaceted approach, but it has to start with the individuals and academics who we know have quite a good basis as to what should be taught, and working with teachers and government to make sure that it's actually implemented in schools. Far too often we see an issue, we know how to resolve that issue, we know the right people to bring about that change and to start putting it forward. However, when it comes to issues of equality, we find that they are always deprioritized. So resources are not put behind them. That's a major issue. So anybody, any government, any council, any school that says it definitely wants to address the issue of the lack of Black education or Black history being taught in schools, they would put the resources behind it. That's the first step. But also, I think, going back to the point I made earlier about learning about slavery and colonialism, because it's such a big part of British history, is actually just that. And I'm sure it's the same as in America. It keeps being called Black history, and I understand why it's called Black history, but it is very much the history of those nations, and we need to make sure that people understand that it is their history too. It is everybody's history. It's about how the nation has come about. So we need to stop seeing it as a separatist thing and one that should be completely embedded. If there is something that is Black history, let's say for Black History Month, I think rather that should be a celebration of our achievements, as opposed to a time when we learn things, because we should be learning about what we have been, what our integral part in that country is throughout our education system and throughout every single year in which we're in school.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ribeiro-Addy. I'll move now to Dr. Sealey. I have a question for you from Mr. Hikwashi, one of our patrons, one of the HACSA patrons, and his question is about status quo warriors. He says, what should the strategy be if these people are resistant or impervious to reason, argument, or even evidence? How should we respond to hardwired racists? Please
Thank you for that.
Your mic.
Yes, thank you for that question. I was encouraged by a video I saw last night on Twitter in New Orleans, where a young woman had been snatched up and taken by the police. And there were literally, I would say, thousands of people that swarmed that police vehicle and demanded that the young woman be released. And within a couple of minutes, they opened the door and she was released. And what that says for me is, in that sense, the status quo warriors, that just came to me yesterday, so I'm still fleshing it out in my mind. But those police who took that protester represents the system, the status quo warriors. And the protesters are the ones who are saying, no, not today. And so we have to have structures that, in effect, say, no, not today. And that those teachers who are blatantly racist, and we know that there are many, what I'm talking about is, because it's endemic, we're talking about this probably has to come, yes, as Sister Bell said, from the federal level, because we know, particularly here in America, resources are allocated based on property taxes. And so the way that communities and neighborhoods have already been structured, I grew up in the housing projects in the Bronx. And so my family did not pay property taxes that would then fund the schools. So if you're living in Scarsdale or in some of the other wealthier neighborhoods within New York, your property taxes will go to the neighborhood schools. And so resources, inequality of resources are embedded in the very structure of the way neighborhoods are. So what am I saying? Suddenly the mayor a couple of days ago said he's going to defund the police by $1 billion of their $6 billion NYPD budget. And that money is going to go towards mental health services, school counselors, and looking to hire Black teachers, all of the things that we need. So I'm saying all of that to say the system has to be changed. And when the system changes, status quo warriors, their positions change. The reason that they are able to continue to do the work of upholding the status quo of inequality is that the system allows it, right? If there are no repercussions, if there's no accountability, much like those protesters that surrounded that car and chanted and clapped until the young lady was released, those police would have taken her off, and, you know, God forbid, it would have been another tragedy, another case that we would be reading about. And so we need to continue to, those of us who are in spheres of influence, I'm talking about Black folks, Latino folks, and particularly white folks who are at the table, need to do the self-excavation to understand that their humanity is tied in with the humanity of others, and that they need to put forward changes that will reallocate resources. We tried with the campaign of fiscal equity a couple of years ago, even suing our own governor. So the resources have to be allocated. When resources are allocated and principals in school districts know that the ethos of their school has to be one of equality, the teachers, the staff members, the status quo warriors will get the message, and things will change.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sealey-Ruiz. And the last question of this live webinar is directed to Mr. Ebenezer Asmati. And the question is, has Oxford University carried out any reforms or involved you in any kind of discourse following the incident at the Oxford Union to improve the situation for minority students? And if you were to advise an African student or a Black student about coming to Oxford, what advice would you give them?
Thank you. I have to say on record that as things stand, the University of Oxford is different from the Oxford Union. So any question asking about, since the incident happened, whether Oxford has put in place any measures or not, it would be a question that will be misplaced a bit. I can speak about whether or not the Oxford Union has put in place any measures to review situations, etc. As it stands, it doesn't seem like, because nothing has been communicated to me. And the point is, I'm even in a legal battle with them because they haven't accepted that they've done anything wrong. So that is how things are as stands. Experience at the University of Oxford, I have to say, is the experience at the University of Oxford differs from person to person, in the sense that the Oxford structure, unlike other universities, is different because you have colleges. So where you live your life at Oxford is your college. And obviously, the people you meet there are different from the people in College B. And since the various colleges also have their own measures and policies in place, my experience in my college, obviously, may be different from somebody else's experience in College B. And the most important thing is, I still find Oxford as a great place. And if any students were applying to Oxford, I will tell them to apply, because it is an institution that imbibes a lot into you. It gives you a lot. Obviously, it is a human institution. It is not perfect. But I believe that if ever we want to make any progress with whatever fights we are fighting for, it has to start from us. And it would not be about withdrawing, because if we withdraw, what happens is the people you are withdrawing from would end up taking whatever you intended to correct. So if anybody is interested in applying to Oxford, of course you must apply. If you don't come in all you can do is to read about whatever is happening here. And you wouldn't be able to make any change by sitting outside. Come in, the experiences are obviously different, and play your part, because we all have a role to play in one way or the other if we want to see the back of what has been happening for the past God knows how long.
Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. We have run out of time, and I just want to pose one last question to the whole panel, because people are begging for really practical advice on how to defeat systemic racism, and the diaspora take hold of their own narrative and their own education. How do you overcome the DNA of racial supremacy, which is in everything, in all institutions or in most institutions? And I'd like one sentence of practical advice from each member of the panel on what people, our listeners, our audience can do to help to make a change, because this webinar is all about activism, people being able to do their little bit to make this a turning point for race relations. And that is not just about Black people, it's about everybody.
So I would say...
So I'll start with Mr. Barry Ford.
Yeah, I would say that protest works, activism works. And so either join a group that is, directly challenging in a peaceful way the status quo in your community or in your city, or if you don't want or can't do it yourself, go out on the street yourself. Support them financially, support them over social media, be a voice and an ally for people who are actively protesting for a better community.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bell Ribeiro-Addy?
I completely agree with Dr. Ford, but I would also add engage in politics. In many of these countries, in many of our countries, the US, the UK, if every single Black person actually took the time to vote, they could determine the outcome of any election. But everybody knows that we don't in our masses vote, and that allows them to ignore us. So engage in democratic processes across the world. People have died for that right to vote. And when we do that, we can show that we are a powerful force and that we cannot be ignored.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Ebenezer Asmati?
If we are the change we seek in the world, then we have to stand our grounds, regardless of whatever the situation is. Stand your grounds. Don't be intimidated. Don't be embarrassed. Let statistics, your views, and whatever it takes to speak for you, and speak firmly wherever you find yourself, whether at the beaches, whether at the debating chamber, whether on the street. If you have the opportunity to write in a newspaper, if you have the opportunity to sit in a classroom, wherever it is you find yourself, make your voice heard firmly and boldly without any intimidation. Because if you don't speak out, your silence remains a tool for those who are perpetuating what is happening.
Thank you. Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, last words from you.
Yes, 4 quick things. Number one, that realize that change is already afoot. Protest. If you haven't been out there, find a protest. Support the Black Lives Matter movement. Number 2, listen to Black women. Number 3, continue to do the self-work through videos, through books, through groups. Find groups to talk with these things about. And number 4, be consistent and recognize that this is a lifelong journey. This is, in America, 401 years It's not going to be overnight that it's dismantled.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to end this webinar by saying race is a fickle social construct, most often manipulated for political gain. In reality, there's only one human race, and all human life originated and emanated from Africa, the cradle of civilization. We are all the sum of our life experiences. It's important that we enlighten and educate those who have not had the opportunity to understand the impact of systemic racism. To borrow a phrase from Dr. Angel Acosta, let's call people in rather than calling them out. Through the HACSA webinar series, we aim to give you different perspectives on matters that concern us all from around the diaspora, sharing our personal perspectives with each other and trying to walk in each other's shoes brings us closer to the ideal of kinship and unity. I'd like to thank our panelists, our audience, and our HACSA webinar production team for their contribution in making this webinar possible and a success. Let's all commit to help make the change and transformation needed to ensure that Black Lives Matter, and understand that we can only have a situation where all lives matter if Black Lives Matter. Thank you very much and goodbye.